This is The Origins of Humankind by On Humans and CARTA with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And in this series we've brought together some of the world's leading experts to piece together the shared origin story of us all. This is episode 3. If you haven't listened to the first 2, don't worry. I really enjoyed making them and I think you'll get a lot out of them. But each episode stands on its own. And honestly, if you want to jump in halfway, this is the place to start. Because for the first time in this series, we are going to zoom right into the story of humanity itself, from the dawn of the genus Homo to the rise, spread, and eventual dominance of us, Homo sapiens. Guiding us along this exciting journey is the legendary Chris Stringer from London's Natural History Museum. Stringer is with little doubt the most influential paleoanthropologist alive. He's not just a great scientist, constantly on the headlines of really groundbreaking papers, but he's also a brilliant communicator of the science of our shared origins. So what a pleasure, what an honor was it to have him on the show. In this episode, we delve into really the big questions. What is a human? Why did we evolve? Why do we have such big brains? Is Homo sapiens a special human or just one among many? And why are we the only ones left? So there's a lot of big questions here, but also there's just so many rich anecdotes. You'll see Stringer is just incredible in his ability to bring stories alive. If you enjoy this conversation, definitely check out the other episodes in this series and make sure to subscribe because the next 2 are going to continue directly from where we end here. There's going to be 2 full episodes on the story of us in the narrow sense of the term, us, Homo sapiens. The first episode will look at us during the Pleistocene ice ages, and the episode 5 will wrap up this story, telling the prehistory and history of the era of agriculture, taking us all the way from the Neolithic Revolution to the rise of gunpowder empires, and thereby finishing the epic story that started with the origin of life, and will end with the dawn of modernity. So hit the subscribe button if you haven't done already so, and if you like the show, if you like what I'm doing here, definitely give On Humans a 5-star review. It really helps. If you want to dig deeper, if you want to get more contents produced by me at On Humans and also by my co-producers at UC San Diego at the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropogeny, who by the way have much more material than me, head to onhumans.substack.com/origins, where you will find links to all of this great stuff. One last thing before we start, this podcast is and will always be free, and you're more than welcome to enjoy it just as it is. However, there are also a handful of people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans, and I'm really grateful to each and every one of them. This series is dedicated to you. Now let's begin. Professor Chris Stringer, welcome to On Humans, and welcome to the 3rd episode of the series on the origins of humankind.
Thank you for having me.
So the first 2 episodes in the series have touched upon humans, but they mostly looked at us from the kind of preconditions that made the origins of humans possible. And with you, we're going to, tackle humans head on, and I can't really imagine a better person to do that than you, and I think that the whole paleoanthropology community is nodding in the background as I say that. But before we talk about the human origins, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story. I've read you describe your own career at the Natural History Museum in London as, quote, a boyhood dream which I never thought would actually come to pass, given my relatively humble origins in the Cockney area of East London.
Yeah.
So how did it come to pass? Take me and take the listeners to, 50s, 60s in the east of London. What made it so that we have your expertise here today?
Well, I think, like many kids today, I was fascinated by prehistoric life, dinosaurs, of course, and fossils. So I was collecting fossils even probably 5 or 6 years old if I was on a beach where there might be something. I mean, a lot of what I found was, I'm sure, probably rubbish and not even fossils, but I collected stuff. My parents were sympathetic. And there was a school broadcast, actually. The BBC had a thing called How Things Began, a radio broadcast that we used to listen to. So probably when I was about 8 or 9, they had a broadcast about the Neanderthals on this program. And so there was this crackly radio speaker in the classroom. And we had a poster on the wall to go with these talks. And it was by the artist Maurice Wilson. And he had painted a picture of Neanderthals burying a child. And this was based, I think, on the site of Teshik Tash in Uzbekistan. And in the program, they, only with sound, of course, they reconstructed this with these wailing Neanderthals mourning their lost child. So this already gripped me that the Neanderthals, were burying their dead, and these posters were fascinating. And I did a school project on Neanderthals a couple of years later. I wish I still had it, but I was drawing Neanderthal skulls and
that
so
could
on.
be valuable today if it existed.
Maybe. I wish I still had it. So that interest was there, but nobody told me later on that I could do this as a career. So I went to a good school in the East End of London for the area, but the career advice was if you were interested in biology and science, then obviously you could train to be a doctor or a vet or something like that. So I was on track to go to medical school. And then just by a complete chance event, one of my friends went for an interview at University College. I think he was going to do physics, but he came back with the prospectus for University College and he said, "Oh, have a look at it, Stringer." He threw it over to me and it opened and it was alphabetic. So at the beginning was A for anthropology. I looked at it and I said, wow, so here is human evolution and archaeology and all of this. And so, I thought, great, I could actually do this at university. No one had told me that the subject even existed. That's how limited my knowledge and my career advice was. So even though I had a place at medical school, I investigated, I got an interview at UCL and they offered me a place. And obviously this was rather a shock to my parents and my school teachers. And I remember my biology teacher said, "Well, you'll never get a job doing that, Stringer." He was almost right. But anyway, I ended up doing anthropology and then I had a year off trying to find funding for a PhD, which is very difficult. But again, I got lucky that a spare PhD grant turned up in Bristol. My supervisor had done a PhD on Neanderthal ham bones, so he was a great supervisor. He'd been around Europe looking at Neanderthal ham bones, and there I was with a project to look at Neanderthal skulls and use what were then very simple methods of multivariate analysis. So I was going to measure all these skulls of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and other groups, and then use multivariate analysis, which was in the early stages of development with the available computing power, to look at the different fossils and use the computer to tell me which things were most similar to each other and which were the most likely ancestors for us, and whether the Neanderthals were our ancestors or not, which was probably the leading belief back in 1970 when I began my PhD.
Yeah, so many people thought then that Neanderthals were the parents of Homo sapiens rather than the siblings or the cousins or however we want to call it.
Yeah.
How early did you come to realize that that's not the case? Well, did you have a hunch from the very beginning?
Once I started looking at the Neanderthal fossils around Europe, I could see that they were distinctive in their own way, and they did seem obviously different to the Homo sapiens. And the prediction of the continuity idea would be that if you had a complete fossil record in Europe, then you would gradually see Neanderthals changing into Homo sapiens. The brow ridge would get smaller, the face would get smaller, they would develop a chin, the skeleton would get more lightly built. And this gradual process would transform them into Homo sapiens. So I was able to access early and late Neanderthal fossils to see whether they were getting more like Homo sapiens. And by the time I got all the data together in 1974, the evidence was that they were not getting more like Homo sapiens. They continued to be different. In some ways, they even became more different through time, in the shape of the face in particular. So they were unlikely ancestors for us, but on the other hand, in 1974, I couldn't say who were the ancestors. If it wasn't Neanderthals, I didn't have a good alternative then. Nobody in 1974 knew where Homo sapiens had originated.
Yeah, it's really striking because I was recently reading a history book by Zainab Badawi, who is the president at SOAS, called An African History of Africa. Yeah. And in the very kind of subtitle of the book cover, it says, from the origin of humanity, we are all Africans. I can't remember exactly, but saying we are all Africans, saying we're all from Africa, that is such a common knowledge that you can print it at the cover of a history book without making a point. You're just stating something. And that was not the case when you were working. And a lot of people thought that the Chinese of today are descendant from the Peking man of the Homo erectus there and the Europeans from Neanderthals.
Yeah. There are still some people who still believe that. That idea has not gone completely. There are still some people who support that. They're in a minority, but they haven't gone away.
Well, of course, there is a complication with the genetics. There was some interbreeding with Neanderthals and sapiens, but doesn't the genetics that we have, isn't it? I mean, proof is a strong word, but to me, it looks pretty much like proof of the fact that we all do come from Africa, with a massive majority of our genes, at least.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've got to separate out the bigger picture. So, of course, most people accept the human lineage originated in Africa, that we began there millions of years ago. But of course, if we're narrowly talking about the origin of our own species, yes, that was very much unknown in the 1970s. And we're in this interesting situation now, as you've mentioned, that everyone outside of Africa who trace their origin outside of Africa today has a bit of Neanderthal DNA from interbreeding that happened 40 or 50,000 years ago. And people in the Far East or Australasia and so on even have DNA from another lot of ancient humans called Denisovans. So I tend to say now mostly out of Africa. It's more than 90% in our genetic makeup is from a recent African origin. And yes, the genetic evidence is pretty overwhelming that is the situation. But we've got this interesting paradox that, yes, we did not evolve from Neanderthals. They're not our direct evolutionary ancestors in a sense of continuity of evolution, but they are partly our ancestors because of this genetic connection. So it's a paradox. We didn't evolve from them. They're partly our ancestors.
So there's a little bit of cousin marriage kind of somewhere along the evolutionary tree, to use that analogy.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly was some mixture, and we're still puzzling over how it happened. I mean, obviously, we know how it happened directly, that a male and a female had sex and had hybrid children, but we don't know what led to it. We don't know whether these were largely friendly encounters or maybe more hostile ones of people stealing from one group to another. It might be a less pleasant way that it happened, but regardless of that process of how it started, those individuals were then brought up in Homo sapiens group, and that's how we now have that around 2% of Neanderthal DNA, you and I, in our genomes.
Well, let's zoom out a little bit. I mean, the big question is that there were people who thought that Neanderthals are our ancestors rather than our cousins. Now we know that's not exactly the way to look at it. We don't really know who's there. we know at some point that there was either Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, however we want to call it, almost certainly is an ancestor a bit less than 2 million years ago. And there's a lot of Latin names. And for anyone who wants to read about each of these species names, I can highly recommend your book, Our Human Story. It's a great place to do that work. But I thought maybe what we could do today is we could zoom out and ask very simply, these are all in some sense humans. You work in the Museum of Natural History. From the place where you stand, how would you answer a simple question? What is a human?
Yeah, it's a simple question, but the answer is not so simple because actually not everyone even agrees that even the Neanderthals are human. So for some people, they use human only for Homo sapiens, and the other things are therefore non-human. And to me, that seems in some ways a dangerous argument because we, as I mentioned, we've got around 2% Neanderthal DNA in our genomes if we were tested, and mine has been tested, so I know that is true. And that then implies that our ancestors interbred with what are we going to call them, animals, if they're not human? So I think this creates other difficulties. So for me, human is a term that I use for the genus Homo. So if anything's in our genus Homo, I say they're human. So the Neanderthals are human, Homo erectus is human, Homo heidelbergensis is human. And what does it mean? Well, there's a complex of characters that make up what I call genus Homo, what I would call human. And they include things like having a larger brain than apes, walking upright regularly with a skeleton that's well adapted to regular walking, and probably also running, being able to run long distances efficiently. We have this great ability to do endurance walking and running compared with many other mammals. And so in the skull, if we look at the skull of Homo, yes, the face is smaller than it is in earlier hominins and in apes, and it's more withdrawn, retracted under the brain case. The teeth are relatively small compared with pre-human forms and with apes. Of course, particularly the canine teeth are close to the size of the teeth around them.
Yeah, if you see a chimpanzee smile, it's pretty scary.
That's right. You haven't got those big canines. So having small teeth and small canines, the jawbone is less robust. So obviously in our case, we've got a chin on the front, but in the earlier Homo, there's no chin, but the jawbone is overall thinner. It's less robust. And that brings us on to the whole skeleton. So the whole muscularity is different. So our skeleton and that of early humans in general, we've left the trees. We have fully committed to life on the ground. Whereas some of these pre-human forms, the Australopithecines, for example, we know from their upper body that they were built to still spend time in the trees. They've got longer arms, they've got curved phalanges, the shoulders are differently shaped and positioned. So they're still spending time in the trees, and their skeleton shows that.
So they're a kind of a hybrid.
They're a mosaic, if you like, of a kind of tree climbing. So things, Australopithecines could walk on the ground as we do bipedally, probably couldn't run so well, but they could certainly walk upright, and their pelvis and legs was adapted to walking upright regularly. But up in the trees, they could climb much better than we could. So, yeah, so there is that difference. So Homo's committed to that life on the ground, to an omnivorous diet, of course. So we eat pretty well everything that's edible. Whereas earlier forms, pre-human forms, we know the Australopithecines, and there is direct evidence from isotopes, for example, that they were largely vegetarian. Of course, they may have eaten meat some of the time, as chimpanzees do. They may have eaten insects some of the time, but largely they were vegetarian. We are largely meat-eating and also vegetarian, and fish-eating, where we can get fish. That's also part of the human diet.
Yeah, I guess when you say mostly, it's not that it's over 50% of calories, but it is a significant minority in most places.
Yeah,
is that
yes,
right?
and it varies, of course. It varies, of course. So in the northern latitudes, so Neanderthals, we know in the winter they must have been dependent very much on meat resources in the far north, because obviously in the winter your access to vegetarian food is much more limited. So meat would have seen them through the winter. But obviously in the spring and summer, they would have made full use of plant foods.
What about the early Homo? Do we know that they were already consuming significantly more meat than the Australopithecines or whoever came before?
Yes, I mean, we can infer that from looking at the sites. So there's evidence from around, even from 2.5 million years ago, we start to see evidence of butchered animal bones. So you find stone tools around the remains of where an animal has been eaten, and the bones have been broken open to get the marrow out. You've got cut marks on the bones, and we see this increasingly after 2 million years. So we know that Homo erectus certainly was actively eating meat, and there's an argument over how much it was actively hunting, and was early Homo erectus still scavenging. And I'm sure that would have been, even later humans wouldn't have turned their nose up at a dead animal that had died not too long ago and that was lying there. They would have eaten it too. And there's some evidence early on that cut marks are on top of scavenging marks. So something like a lion or a hyena has had access to the carcass first, and then you've got cut marks on top of it. But when we move through the archaeological record into the last 500,000 years, increasingly the human cut marks are first, and any carnivore marks or scavenger marks are on top of those.
Oh, interesting.
So that balance changes. Yeah.
Interesting. So basically the big story is that the Australopithecines, the pre-humans on the hominin lineage, they had already started spending more time on the ground. The backdrop to all of this is a climate change where the tree cover is slowly, it's not disappearing necessarily, but it's becoming sparser and sparser in Africa. I had Ian Tattersall on the show around a year ago, and we actually started our conversation talking about this incredible link between geology and human evolution, of how the Isthmus of Panama forms around the same time, blocking the currents, the ocean currents that are pouring into the Atlantic from the Pacific, creating a big climate change. And later in the fossil record, we start seeing these creatures that are clearly fully adapted to life on the ground. They are eating meat. They're not only eating meat, but they are eating meat. And they are using these stone tools. Now, that's an interesting one. I mean, there used to be a belief that the first stone tools, that's kind of what makes us human. Some people would have said that what makes someone be part of Genus Homo is that they're making stone tools. Now, we seem to have some evidence of Australopithecines here and there having also had stone tools. But I guess it's still true that stone tools become a really big deal and a kind of omnipresent thing in the record with humans. First of all, is that right? And if that is right, what were they using stone tools for, the early humans? Was it just cracking bones open, or do we have evidence of them using them for other things?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, you're right. Yes, that there's evidence that even in the pre-human phase, there was some tool making going on and tool using. And we know that, modern apes and modern monkeys will make or use tools at times. So it's no longer so when I was, beginning my career, man the tool maker, this was the view.
Yes.
Only humans really were tool makers and tool users. And we know that's not true anymore. But it's the extent to which we do it, the extent to which we're really dependent on tools for survival, more than any other animal, really. So it's an essential part of the human adaptation. And yes, those early humans, of course, must not have just been using stone tools, but using wood a great deal. And unfortunately, all the evidence of that from the early period has disappeared.
Yeah, we talked about this with Dean Falk, actually, in part 2 of this series. She just released a book called Botanic Age, which is very much based on this exact dilemma that we don't know. We know they were doing something, but we don't know what they were doing. But what with the stone tools? I mean, with, for example, not just using rocks as tools, which monkeys, chimpanzees, whatnot, all sorts of other primates do, but using rocks to shape other rocks to use as tools. When that starts to become a big part of the human lifestyle, is it just to crack open these bones, or do we have any good, strong evidence or some fun speculations on what else stone tools could have been used for?
Well, I think those tools were also being used, as you say, the tools are being used to make tools. Tools are being used to process food, so crushing nuts and seed. And there's even traces sometimes on the stone tools of where they've been used to process vegetable materials. Of course, later on at 300,000 years, we've got these beautiful wooden spears, close to 2 meters long, from Germany. And so 300,000 years ago, an early human, perhaps a Neanderthal or a late form of Heidelbergensis, was making these beautifully shaped javelins, throwing spears. And again, they must have had stone tools to shape those down to exactly the weight and the balance they needed. So the tools are being used there on wood, and in most cases the wood has disappeared. And of course they would have used tools to process skins as well for clothing. So we don't know for sure when clothing began, but by the time we get to the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, who we might talk about if we have time, those people, some of them are living in really quite cold conditions in the winter, and it's pretty certain they had clothing. So to process animal skins, again, they would have had stone tools to scrape those furs, soften them, and process them, get off all the grease and fat to make these into wearable clothing or for structures to make tents and so on. And we used to think only Homo sapiens made complex tools where you put two things together to make a tool. For example, putting a spear head onto a wooden handle. We thought that was special for Homo sapiens. We know the Neanderthals were doing that as well. And sometimes they were even making resin from plant material, like a glue, to stick things together.
Oh, interesting.
So that's a very human behavior that we know the Neanderthals were capable of as well.
Very interesting. Well, let's look at this life on the... I hesitate a little bit saying life on the savannah. I know that there are people who say that, well, it wasn't just on the savannah that the early humans lived. They were probably a bit more versatile. But this kind of on-the-ground life, probably quite a lot of it in broadly savannah-looking habitats in Africa. If we look at this early phase, there's a couple of paradoxes almost that stand out to me as really interesting puzzles, which both have to do with what is perhaps the most obviously important part of this human story, which is the increasing brain size. It's a very energy-hungry organ of the body. The brain tissue needs a lot of calories. So where do those calories come from? Well, there's an additional level to that, which is that as our brain increases, our guts get smaller, right? So there must be some kind of extra efficiency where not only are we able to get more calories to feed the brain, but we're able to do with a smaller and smaller gut, which is one of those kind of very obvious differences if you look at an early human skeleton. When I, with my untrained eye, look at the humans versus the Australopithecines still seem to have a bit of a chimpanzee-like belly, you know,
Yeah.
and the early humans not. So there's this whole industry now. There's a whole cottage industry in figuring out what exactly gave all these extra calories. Richard Wrangham famously speculated this must be fire, that there must be fire used much earlier than we have evidence for it. You mentioned bone marrow. That I think some people talk about bone marrow as something that you really don't need to cook. If you can access it, that in itself is easy to digest and gives a lot of calories. There are those who think that marine resources, anyone who goes to sushi restaurants knows that you can eat quite a lot of raw fish and whatever oysters, and they also have the omega-3s, which are important for brain growth. And then there's a fourth really interesting hypothesis from quite recently, which is fermentation. That if you carry and store food, you might accidentally let them ferment, and fermentation is what the gut does. And so if you can externally ferment them, I personally love fermented food, so I'm a big fan nowadays of this hypothesis.
yeah.
But given I don't know, is there a fifth one? Am I missing something? And if not, then out of these four, how would you rate these in terms of plausibility at the moment?
Yeah. So yes, it's clear that we found a way to unlock resources that gave us the energy to evolve and run that bigger brain, and it uses about 20% of our body energy. So it is a very thirsty organ, and it needs processed, rich diet to do that. So, when you think of the amount of time a gorilla has to spend feeding that bulky body with vegetable materials, it spends a lot of time feeding. We have to spend less time feeding if we get that concentrated source of food. Meat is obviously important. There are some plant materials that are quite rich. But yes, how did we unlock those extra calories that we needed? And that's a very good question. I think Richard Wrangham, it's a really interesting idea. I wish we had evidence, really strong evidence of fire use from 1.5 million years ago, because that would help us with this problem of how did they unlock all this extra source from their food. And for me, there isn't really strong evidence. There's occasional use of fire. Maybe they're capturing natural fires and using them. But I think systematic fire making, control of fire, comes much later.
And we even have evidence of Neanderthals using fire. I've heard this actually, I think I heard this from you, that we have evidence of Neanderthals having the capacity to do fire, doing fire and eating raw meat on the side.
Yeah, that's
which
true,
also
yes.
seems to go a little bit against the fire being the only solution. There must be other solutions.
Sure, yes. In Gibraltar, we excavated sites where, we've got fire making, and then there's raw bone being broken open with no evidence it's been cooked or heated. So raw marrow would have been nutritious. And I think fermentation is important. It's been a neglected source. And I think that even processing the food, even pounding the food, breaking down the food, it doesn't necessarily have to be heated. It can even just be pounded, and that makes it easier to digest as well, to unlock the main source in nuts and so on. You break them open, you crush them down. They're easier to digest. You'll get more out of them.
That's really interesting. Yes.
Yeah. There is another resource which I wrote a paper about with my colleague Laura Buck, which is stomach contents. Now, we don't tend to think about that as a source, but of course, when they're butchering an animal, these early humans, they're going to get everything out of it. We know at Boxgrove, for example, they broke open a rhino skull and took the brain out, and they probably just ate it raw on the spot.
By the way, sorry to interrupt, but I have to, just for listeners, this is a really incredible finding, because there were humans, not Homo sapiens, but humans living in Britain.
Yes.
Not far from London, if I'm right, butchering hippos.
Yeah, we haven't actually got a butchered hippo, but we've got butchered rhinos. Certainly.
Oh, rhinos! Sorry.
Hippos did live in Britain. Yes, there were hippos. There were hippos swimming in the River Thames 120,000 years ago.
That's incredible.
And hippos are in Britain a number of times when it's warm enough. When the waters are warm enough, we have hippos. Most of the time, actually, we don't have humans interacting with them. So at 120,000 years, we actually haven't got any evidence that humans were alongside those hippos. The Neanderthals were alongside hippos in Italy, but in Britain, we don't have evidence of that connection. But 500,000 years ago, yes, they were certainly alongside rhinos and lions and hyenas and bears and wolves in a dangerous world, but they were out on that landscape successfully, butchering horse and deer and even rhinos. And they were getting every bit of meat off those carcasses. So they had plenty of time to do it. While some people were butchering, other people must have been guarding the carcass to keep the competition away, because there would have been vultures, there would have been hyenas, all kinds of animals would be attracted to that carcass.
And I don't think an individual would even be able to kill the rhino, so this must have been a complicated team effort.
We don't know whether they happened upon a dead rhino or got lucky, managed to kill it in some way. We don't know. But there were actually 4 rhinos that were butchered at Boxgrove, so it's not even a one-off event. So they're really dangerous animals, of course. So that's quite something to think about. But the fact they got all the meat off the carcass meant that also inside it, there'll be the internal organs, which we don't think about. So thinking of the stomach, of course, these animals, and we think particularly of things like deer and reindeer, they go in the winter, they exploit, obviously, they're still able to get food by digging under the snow to get their food. And then, of course, they swallow it and they digest it in their stomachs. Now, if you then hunt a reindeer or a deer, not only have you got all the meat, but you've also got the stomach.
Oh, interesting. It's pre-processed food for you.
Yeah, it's pre-processed food. Apparently tastes a bit like sort of sour yogurt, a sort of yogurty, sour cheese flavour. And so this was a treat for them. And so I think the Neanderthals and even our ancestors in Africa, they would have used those stomach contents. So the animal's gut does a lot of the digestive work, and then you benefit from it, from eating the contents of the guts.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Okay, so there's a big mix. By the way, can I have a really quick, maybe 30-second view from you on the importance of marine life, fish, shellfish, oysters in the early stage of human evolution? We know Homo sapiens starts using them a lot. Do you think it started very early? Do you think it might even be one of the keys? Because there is this whole kind of water side hypothesis of humans being particularly well adapted to swimming when compared to other apes, for example.
Yeah, I think that certainly early humans were aware of marine resources. I don't think they concentrated on them to the extent that came later. So in Gibraltar, we know Neanderthals were well aware of the marine resources there. They were collecting shellfish and cooking them. They were butchering seal and dolphin. But that's in the last 100,000 years. Earlier on, of course, people are living also in African lakes where there are shellfish. They must have been aware of that as a source of food. We know people at Haysborough in Britain 900,000 years ago. There were people living alongside the River Thames, and we've got their footprints. And they may be the species Homo antecessor, which we know of from about that date in Spain. We don't have the fossils, we have stone tools, and we have their footprints. But they're alongside this great big river, which was the River Thames, which then flowed out further north than its present course. And they're alongside there. So why are they alongside that river? Maybe there are things like seaweeds. Maybe they're eating seaweed there. They would have been aware, and seeing other animals eating these foods as well would have given them ideas of, that's something we should try for food. So I think when they lived in the right places, then they would have exploited that as a source of food. But of course, there are other populations who were inland, they weren't by huge rivers. They might have been in more open country. You mentioned savanna. They weren't necessarily, obviously they're going to need water supplies, but perhaps there wasn't the density of food supplies by the water, which you find if you're on the coast or by a big lake.
Okay, well, I mentioned that there are two kind of paradoxes. One was this big brain, small gut. Where do the calories come from? Another thing is that what happens is that, big brains are typically associated with long childhoods. And we, Homo sapiens, we have tremendously long childhoods with this long adolescence and so on, that any parent is very well aware of, also the helplessness of our children. Now, what would make sense kind of from armchair logic would be that then humans start having less and less children. They invest more in each individual. But what's really remarkable is that humans actually have children much faster with less intervals than the average chimpanzee interval is 7 years between the offspring. And in humans, it varies between the populations, but it's not atypical to have a sibling who's 2 years older. So how can humans both have more helpless babies who stay immature for much longer and keep having them more? This seems to be, I think, one of the things that we have to address some way if we want to understand what it means to be human. I've had Sarah Buffer Hardy on the show, for example. Her answer, it would be the role of alloparents, uncles, aunties, whatnot. But also in her recent work, she's focused also on the role of fathers. What do you think? How beyond just the "it takes a village" slogan, what do you think we know? What can we say about the way in which this really puzzling life history pattern in humans, how did it emerge? How can we sustain it? And what does it tell us about ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't really my area of research, but obviously I think there has to be more social support by other individuals, as you've said. Also a way of getting the child onto solid foods earlier to be able to provision that child. And that's where I think, grandparents are going to be important in taking over. And as a child grows up, okay, the adults may be off foraging and hunting, but the grandparents maybe are teaching these children how to find the local food. And I think that became increasingly important with Homo sapiens, because once we have the development of things like nets and fibers, you can make traps, you can make nets, you can make snares. And so I think that there would have been, the parents had gone off maybe to get the primary food supplies, but then the ones who are left behind, maybe the older individuals who aren't so active, aren't able to travel long distances or run for hunting activity, they're taking their grandchildren around and showing them how to catch local game, how to catch birds, how to get fish using nets from the local area. And so they're feeding themselves. There's already food there in that local area. And okay, if the hunt is lucky, they'll bring back meat. And if the foragers are lucky, they're going to bring back lots of vegetable resources. But by also increasing the intensity of exploitation of local resources, those older individuals are able to help support both themselves and those young children. And that may have helped grow the numbers of children. But of course, there's also the concern that a lot of these children are dying. There will still be high infant mortality.
Yeah. In modern hunter-gatherers, it's remarkable. It's it can be 50%.
Yes. So, of course, the more you have, the more you hope are going to survive. But if you haven't got many kids, then survival is critical for those ones that you've got. But by having more kids, you're maximizing your chance of getting your genes into the next generation as long as they survive. And clearly human numbers did not grow at any great rate in the Pleistocene. We know that. It's not until we get to Homo sapiens that we start to see a takeoff in numbers. The early humans, they're living at really quite low numbers, at low density in the landscape. The Neanderthals, I think, near the end of their time in their last 20,000 years, from genetic data, we know that they were low in numbers and low in genetic diversity. So the Neanderthals were an endangered species, even though they've been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years. They were having a tough time to survive. And Homo sapiens had a tough time, I'm sure, in Africa. There must have been many populations that went completely extinct. So, yes, I think success is a relative term, and we've got to imagine for every group that we know of in the fossil record, there will be many groups that disappeared without trace.
Yeah, and the amount of names for different human species has just been exploding recently. But the funny thing is that if we, on the one hand, we can look at this and just imagine a really fantasy kind of Tolkien Middle-earth style moment where you literally have these, giants and hobbits and whatnot living not necessarily close quarters by each other, but on the same earth. What's really striking is that the more we seem to know about all these different Denisovans, hobbits, the Dragon Man, as your Chinese colleagues have dubbed the Heilongjiang excavated fossil recently. There's all of these ones, but we still don't know. We seem to know less and less about who actually is our ancestor, because that's where we started the question: are Neanderthals our ancestor? Well, no. We just don't seem to know. And I've noticed that you used to believe that Homo heidelbergensis is the ancestor of both sapiens and Neanderthals, and you've seemed to change your mind about that, but not because there's a better alternative, but because there is this thing called model in the middle, where we just don't know what happens.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably where we should keep our eyes open and see if we get any clarity to that. But if we think about this model in the middle, and the middle, maybe to combine the images, the model in the Middle Earth, is there anything anything exciting that has been coming up? Any hope of finding our, not the distant ancestor, the Homo erectus in Africa, or Homo ergaster as some people call those, from that the line towards sapiens, it seems to be so muddled. Is there anything you want to say about that? Or is it just a muddle?
Yeah, well, it is a muddle, and we've even had this new species, big-headed man, created on Chinese fossils, Homo juliensis. I don't think it's a very good species name. I don't think it'll have much longevity, but that's a new species name for some of the Chinese fossils. And we had Homo longi, of course, applied to the Harbin cranium. And I think there are many other Chinese fossils that probably belong in that species, the Dragoman species. So I think what we can say is, yes, in the big picture, yes, there were, as you said, there were even 100,000 years ago, incredibly, there were 5 or 6 kinds of humans around on Earth. And of course, we have to be careful using the term human because, I mentioned that, yes, I think Erectus is human and Heidelbergensis is human, Neanderthal is human. For Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit on Flores, for Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, whether they're really human, I think they're very close to our kind of threshold.
They're pushing the boundaries.
And I think it remains to be determined whether they actually will, in the long term, stay in the genus Homo. And maybe Homo naledi is another case of something which may or may not stay in the genus Homo in the long term. So maybe they will eventually be excluded from being human in my usage of the word. But there were certainly 5 or 6 kinds around. We've been evolving in Africa. The Neanderthals have been evolving in Europe and Asia. The Denisovans have been evolving over in the Far East. We've got Floresiensis on Flores and Luzonensis in the Philippines. Maybe Erectus. We don't know when Erectus disappeared in Java. It could still have been around 100,000 or less years ago. So that's what we know about. There could even be more surprises to come. When we have more from those islands of Southeast Asia, we might find there are other kind of experiments like the Hobbit and Luzonensis on some of those other islands where we've got stone tools but no evidence of who was making them 100,000 years ago. So I think we've got a lot to learn. But putting back, as you say, yes, if we're looking narrowly at the ancestry of us and the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and Homo longi, and I think that's an interesting thing in the Far East, that, we know from the DNA that there's this long-lasting lineage of a distinct kind of human called the Denisovans, based mainly on DNA, but we have a few fossils being added, such as that jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau of China, from Jiahe, pretty certainly is a Denisovan. And then we've got this group of Chinese humans, so the Dragoman group, Dali, Wolong-Dong, these fossils, are they Denisovans? And a lot of people are asking that question. I think with ongoing work, we're going to show that a lot of them are going to turn out to be Denisovans.
Yes, it might be that the Dragon Man, who we have the fossils but not the DNA, and the Denisovans, who we have the DNA but not proper fossils, they're actually just the same.
Yeah, and there's proteomic work going on those fossils. And I think, if it works out, we may be in a better position, if you ask me in a year or two, to say that essentially we've got 3 advanced lineages, if you want to say, of humans. We've got the sapiens lineage, the Neanderthal lineage, and the Denisovan longi lineage.
Yeah.
And of course, the question in the longer term will be, are we going to call Homo longi Denisovans, or are we going to call Denisovans Homo longi? And so that's the thing for the future. But the common ancestor, of course, is what we want. As you say, I used to think Heidelbergensis was the common ancestor, but now I think that some of those fossils are too young anyway to be ancestral, and also they have their own derived features and form a distinct group. And so I've been working with Chinese colleagues, and particularly Zhiyong Ni. We worked on the Dragoman fossil, and now we're working on other material from China. And I think that material will prove to be important in the story. And some of that material is 1 million years old, and it may be that material will help us unravel this question, because I think the growing pattern is that the ancestry is further back in time. So the common ancestor of us and the Neanderthals and, let's say, Longi or Denisovans, I think most people have said, well, maybe 500,000 or 700,000 years. I think that common ancestry could be closer to 1 million years.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So if we put it back to 1 million years, then of course other things come into play. We've got Homo antecessor. We've got some of these Chinese fossils. We've got fossils in Africa, from Buia, for example, and Dakar. So these things might now be worth considering as being close to that common ancestor. So I think we will sort the muddle in the middle out, but it's going to take a little bit longer. But proteomic data, and we haven't really had a chance to talk about that, but obviously with DNA, we know preservation. Unfortunately, the further you back in time, the less DNA there is. And in a place like Africa, there won't be good DNA survival in ancient times, unfortunately. But looking at fossil proteins, they survive better. And people are starting to apply them now to some of these fossils. And I think that's going to help us map out, which are the relationships of some of these puzzling things.
And in a way, when we study the proteins, it's like instead of studying the recipe book, the DNA, you study the actual foods produced.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Let's then look at how we Homo sapiens, how we fit into this picture. And these holes, I mean, there used to be, and there has, I think, one of the most common misunderstandings that experts like you want to correct is typically that there's no one progression, where you just get a better and better and better human until you get to Homo sapiens. It's a much more messy. Ian Tattersall, who I mentioned earlier, I think he has the image of saying that we should think about it as a bush more than as a sunflower, where it just shoots up. And I thought that what could be maybe fun is I'm going to try to push back on that a little bit, and then you can tell me where I get this wrong. And the pushback would be this: that yes, of course, we have all of these other humans, but if we just look at us, there's a lot of things where we, Homo sapiens, are a kind of seem to be just the if not the end point, and at least on the curve in a development that started early, that you already described when you were describing what is human. So just as an example, we have very big brains. The Neanderthals too, but that was like a consistent trend that seems to continue. We get towards us. We have very narrow hips. The narrowing hip was one of the things that happened with the early humans. We have very small teeth, right? Smaller teeth was one of those things that was mentioned. We have exceedingly long childhoods, and I learned from you also discuss this in some of the discussion around Neanderthals versus sapiens. We have more grandparents. We seem to mature, if anything, slower than even the Neanderthals. So maybe I'm cherry picking on purpose here a little bit, but is there a case to be made, which I know isn't a particularly trendy case to be made, but is there a case to be made that we are not an accident in a kind of bushy humanity could go this way or that way, but there is a way in which it was, if not predetermined, there was a big inclination, even at the start, that there was an aim towards something, the narrow hips, the big brains. And look, lo and behold, here we are with those features. I'm very, very keen to hear your reactions on this kind of very heretical thinking.
Yes, I think we do take some of these trends to the ultimate that we see them at the moment. But of course, we've got to think, well, the Neanderthals disappeared 40,000 years ago. Given another 40,000 years, they too would have carried on evolving. And tooth size varies in Homo sapiens, of course, around the world. Floresiensis has very small teeth, and so does Luzonensis, even smaller than many of us today. So it isn't just us in tooth size. In terms of brain size, yes, biggest brain sizes in fossils that we know of are in a Neanderthal from Amud and in the Zhuqiang fossil from China. So those are actually the biggest fossil brain sizes, so not in our lineage. So, we have to put that in perspective. But in terms of cultural complexity, yes, of course, we have this very complex behavior. And it seems to really take off when we look at material from Europe that's 30 or 35,000 years old. Already we've got this beautiful cave art, these little statuettes being made in mammoth ivory and little clay statuettes of people. We don't see that earlier on. But again, it's absence of evidence earlier on. Was this going on even earlier? And I tend to think, we've got painted caves now over in Sulawesi that are actually older in terms of animal representations than the ones in Europe. So all the way over in Sulawesi, people were painting pictures of pigs 45,000 years ago.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought the culture up because, of course, the stone tools are also one of these things where you could see like a progression from, they start making stone tools, they're going to start making really good ones later on, and the most complicated stone tool cultures is with sapiens.
So I was just going to make the point that cave art is at two ends of the Eurasian continent. It's over in Sulawesi and it's over in Europe. And I think probably it was in Africa. And it came out, that ability to make representation, I think, was in Homo sapiens, and it came out of Africa more than 50,000 years ago. It stayed in Africa too, of course. So I think that was there already earlier on. And we know Neanderthals were doing some of these things. And that's what I think one of the most astonishing things. Well, I think there's a couple. So in terms of human behavior, 20 years ago, I would have said there's this huge behavioral gulf between us and all these other earlier humans. And now a site like Boxgrove has shown us how complex and how well adapted those people were 500,000 years ago. Their way of life, they were really doing well on that landscape, it seemed, and hunting dangerous animals. Maybe they had spears even then, we don't know for sure. And then the Neanderthals apparently produced this incredible structure in Bruniquel Cave. And I don't know whether you heard about this one, but deep in a cave in France, well into the dark zone, hundreds of meters from the entrance, they found these structures made of stalagmites. So someone 175,000 years ago, and therefore we guess it had to be Neanderthals, had gone deep into that cave with torches, with light, artificial light, burning torches and burning animal fat. And they had broken stalagmites to a set size, about 30 centimeters long, and they dry stone walled and made two big oval structures in that cave. And, we have the remains of them now, and we don't have any idea what they were for. They haven't yet excavated the floor of these structures, but were these the base of huts? Were they some kind of hide for them to hide in and maybe get bears when they were waking from their hibernation? Was it some kind of, symbolic structure? People think they could have had some religious beliefs. It's like a shrine. But this is really a complex structure. It required days of work, cooperation by groups of people in the pitch black. They've got to have food down there. They've got to have lighting. They've got to have fuel for their lights. So what were they doing down there? And this is 175,000 years ago. So that just shows us what we're missing even for Neanderthals. How much more complexity is there for us to get? So that gulf between us and Neanderthals that I would have talked about 20 years ago, some people say it's completely disappeared. I don't go that far. I think there still is a gulf, but it's a much closer in terms of complexity of behavior. Certainly, if we went to the Earth 100,000 years ago and looked at all these groups of humans and human-like creatures that were around, would we have pointed in Africa at Homo sapiens, said, yep, they're the ones who are going to replace all the others? No, I don't think we would have on the evidence 100,000 years ago, no.
That's a very interesting thought experiment. But we are the only ones. You actually have a whole book titled Lone Survivors.
Yes.
It's a great book, and it's a great title. There's no way we're going to be able to do justice to that whole question of why are we the only ones around. But I thought that maybe I can throw one idea at you, which I've covered on the show before, I've thought about a lot, and I saw something a little bit analogous in the way that you approach this topic. So when we look at the skulls of these different Homo species, one of the things that is really striking to an untrained eye like myself is how the brow ridges, the bones behind the eyebrows, are so almost fearsome looking in all the other humans.
Yeah.
And they really flatten out, not only so that when you compare sapiens to others, but also if you compare very old sapiens skulls to more recent ones. In the big picture, not like 1,000 years ago, but in the big picture, they become flatter and flatter and flatter. Now, Richard Wrangham, whose name came up earlier, relevant to his work on fire, that was his second big book, was Catching Fire. Well, his third big book is The Goodness Paradox, which is related to his work on the so-called human self-domestication hypothesis. And the way that he explained this to me is that if you look at a skull of, say, sapiens and compare it to, say, a skull of Homo heidelbergensis, the changes that you see, for example, with the brow ridge, are, in his eyes, analogous to what happens when you take a dog skull and compare it to a wolf skull. And so the idea here is that there could have been a selection against what he calls reactive aggression. So yes, we can do horrible things strategic. We can use violence for strategic reasons, but the pub brawl would have been less likely in sapiens than in these other humans, is what he thinks. And this could have allowed bigger group sizes, more people living relatively peacefully together, which could have explained how even with the same brain size, we could have had more technological evolution. Because there's just more people around. And before his work on this, you already had written Lone Survivors, and I saw there that you also discussed this, some evidence there that maybe the group sizes were a bit different, or a bit bigger, more densely populated. Maybe there was a bit more cultural exchange between sapiens. So what do you make of the self-domestication hypothesis in particular, and about this general way of looking at the lone survivors question from the lens of not what the individual human is capable of doing with their brain, but rather maybe if our group sizes were somehow bigger, allowed maybe by this more friendly nature, by the lack of a better word?
Yes. So, yeah, I certainly did discuss this, as you say, in Lone Survivors, or the British version, Origin of Our Species, that, yes, Homo sapiens certainly seems to have large group sizes and more networking across the landscape, more connection with the neighbours. And I think this was an important part of our success. Neanderthals and those earlier humans were living in smaller groups, probably less well connected across the landscape, and living in smaller numbers too. So with us, that networking is important to spread information, to spread knowledge. When you've only got small groups and there are a few specialists in that group, so let's imagine the people making the spears 300,000 years ago in Germany. There are a few of them who have that special knowledge of how to select the trees and how to make those spears. Now, if those individuals die in a hunting accident or disease, the group may have lost that knowledge entirely, and they've got to then relearn it by reconnecting with another group that still has that knowledge. And also there's the possibility of climate change. So within maybe 10,000 years of them being there, those forests probably completely disappeared when the Ice Age arrived. So they've got no wood left to even make the spears. So all these things will be going on to store or not store knowledge. And larger groups and larger networking gives you that greater capability of maintaining your knowledge. So that was an advantage for Homo sapiens. And back to the brow ridge, yes, I think that Rang's idea is very interesting. This self-domestication idea, of course, when you look at us and the domestic animals, the fact even our brain size is smaller than, the Homo sapiens who lived 40 or 50,000 years ago. And that's true of most domestic animals, have smaller brain sizes.
Yeah, that surprises many people when they hear it. Yeah.
I mean, looking at some of the politics today, maybe it's not so difficult to believe that people's brains are getting smaller. But that's another story. I better not get into that one. But the brow ridge itself is an interesting clue because, of course, it's a puzzle why all these early humans have these massive brow ridges. And in some of the biggest ones, you think of the Heidelbergensis skulls, when you take a CT scan of those skulls, these brow ridges are hollowed out. They're almost empty inside. They've got a big sinus space. So they're big externally, but the actual thickness of bone in them is minimal. So they're not doing anything functional, which used to be one of the ideas, is that they're functional to resist blows on the head or absorb stresses and strains. It looks like they're meant to be large externally. And I think they're part of a signalling system between the individuals, which would go in with Wrangham's idea about aggression, that these brow ridges are accentuating stares, keep away from my food, keep away from my partner. Those brow ridges are focusing vision. There's a guy called Grover Krantz, a very eccentric American anthropologist, sadly no longer with us, but he was fascinated. In the 1970s, he was a real experimental anthropologist. He made himself a set of Homo erectus brow ridges, and he strapped them to his head, and he wore them for 6 months, day and night, to see what they did for him. And he wrote a paper about it called Cranial Hair and Brow Ridges. And he came up with, I don't think, a very convincing story. This was in the 70s, and he had long hair. Before he wore the brow ridges, when he ran along, he found his hair fell in his eyes. But when he had the brow ridge on, his hair swept back nicely by the side, so he could see where he was going. Now, to me, these people are using sharp tools to cut meat and plant material. How come they couldn't work to cut their hair? Anyway, So I don't think that was the best explanation. But another explanation he had was it was a great sunshade. So on a very sunny day, he didn't need his sunglasses because he had this big brow ridge. So he could imagine Homo erectus on the plains of Africa being able to see further. Where's the food? Where are the dead animals? Where are the plant resources? But also the third thing that I think is the most convincing is that people who met him on a dark night suddenly were totally scared because there was this guy with these great big brow ridges, and so it was a huge signal, possibly an aggressive signal. So I think he was right that it's a signalling system. And the point is, okay, you could say that we're much less aggressive, which would be the Wrangham viewpoint, but also we have many other ways of signalling. When you think of, what you see, when you see a person, They may have a very weird hairstyle, a different hairstyle. They may have tattoos. They may have piercings. They may have, lipstick, paint, makeup. Their body may be adorned with all kinds of extra things like necklaces and jewelry and things. So we signal to each other in all kinds of other ways. Plus, they might have a great big weapon as well. That would also be a powerful signal.
Yes,
so
yes.
I think that we have left that behind, that big brow ridge, as a signalling system. And also, we've got this high forehead. So, in a sense, our eyebrows become more important. And some people in the University of York wrote a paper where they said that eyebrow signalling became important in Homo sapiens compared with these earlier humans. And I think that could be a factor as well.
Interesting. Yeah, if I remember right, and I should have checked this, I don't remember, but I do think that the Wrangham story, also by Brian Hare, who has the book Survival of the Friendliest, about this, I think that they seem to suggest that it has something to do with the levels of testosterone in early stage of pregnancy.
Yes, I think hormones are going to be an important part of that story.
Yeah,
yes,
and so they saw it almost like
a
not as a signaling thing, but as a byproduct of this change in lower levels of testosterone earlier. But it's really, really fun to hear you talk about that. We're approaching the end. This has been overall an amazing tour. For anyone out there, if you want to read a book which really focuses on these final questions that we've talked about, Lone Survivors is a wonderful one, or Our Human Story, which I mentioned earlier, will acquaint you with all of these Latin names and all the cousins, grandparents, whatever on the evolutionary tree. Before we finish, I have one final question that I ask all my guests, which is, how has all your work, all your research, how has it shaped your outlook on humanity?
Right, yes. So, well, I think it's been good, really, because part of my work has been looking at the climate factors. And so I wrote a book called Homo Britannicus, which came out in 2006, I think, which looked at the British climate story and human evolution. And what we showed was, or what I showed in that book, I was in a project called the Ancient Human Occupation of Britain Project with a fantastic group of colleagues, and we were studying the whole British story of early humans. When were humans in Britain? When were they not in Britain? What was controlling whether they were there or not? How important was the climate? When was there a land bridge connecting us with Europe? All of these things we looked at in this project, which ran for 12 years. And so I wrote this book, Homo Britannicus, really to kind of summarize that British story. And what it showed us was how important climate was in controlling whether people were in Britain or not. So, as you know, we get these peaks of warm and cold about every 100,000 years. So we have this eccentricity signal in the Earth's orbit. So sometimes our orbit is more circular, and then the climate is more even around the year. But at times, Jupiter and Saturn, those great big outer planets, if they're lined up, they actually stretch the orbits of the inner planets and make them more elliptical. So you have less sunlight at some times of the year than others. And that 100,000-year eccentricity signal dominates the pattern in the last 500,000 or 600,000 years. So every 100,000 years, Britain goes into extreme cold, the peak of an ice age, and we have an ice cap spreading over a lot of Britain. And also, every 100,000 years, it warms up. After that ice goes, we get a warm period, like when the hippos were swimming in the River Thames. It was warm enough for that. So this British climate goes through these real extremes, probably more extreme than almost any other part of the world in those climate extremes. And when it got really cold, everyone in Britain died out. And when it got really warm, there were times when the sea level was high, like 120,000 years ago, and nobody was in Britain because they didn't have boats, the Neanderthals, to get across. So climate was controlling whether we find people in Britain. And Britain was populated probably by 4 different species and at least 12 different occupations we could map. And 11 of them failed or disappeared. And we're the last one of those. Now, we're in that 12th occupation in Britain now. But will we be here for long? In the last chapter of that book, I look forward at the climate, and I predicted, unfortunately in 2006, I predicted a lot of things that we're seeing now in terms of the climate. Completely unpredictable weather, floods, really strong hurricanes, a huge increase in forest fires from having those dry summers, the increasing aridity around the Mediterranean, huge increase in immigration and movements of people trying to flee from these areas. So unfortunately, I predicted, nearly 20 years ago, a lot of the things that we're seeing now. And I fear that, we are going into a very dangerous era now where there are people who don't believe in climate change in control of some of the biggest nations in the world. And that's very bad news for all of us, I think.
Well, Professor Chris Stringer, you mentioned in the beginning that one of the things that was putting you towards this path was listening to a broadcast. I hope that maybe listening to your words today on this podcast might have inspired some young minds to take the same path. But
I hope so.
But thank you so much for your time and for all the research. I mean, you've been such an important figure to so many people in the field, I'm sure, but also outside of the field, like myself, who look in for inspiration and knowledge and a little bit of self-understanding.
Great speaking to you.
So that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end, and stay tuned for next week and episode 4, the story of sapiens, with no other than the director of Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, Johannes Krause. So stay tuned, subscribe, and for more material head to onhumans.substack.com/origins. You'll find that link and others in the show notes. Until next time, take care.